All right, third lecture for chapter 19 here. We're going to talk some more about capillaries, very important little microscopic blood vessels. Oh, come on, computer. Here we go. All right, so your capillaries are, as I mentioned earlier, microscopic blood vessels. So they don't have, we were looking at those three layers, those three tunics of the arteries and the veins. They only have one. They have a very thin tunica intima, and it's really just a single, the whole wall is just a single layer of flattened cells. Then they have a very thin, what we call a basement membrane that separates that thin layer of simple squamous epithelium from the surrounding tissues where these capillaries are located. Now they do have a few scattered around. There are some cells called pericytes, peri like perimeter to surround something, that are kind of hanging out here around the edges of the wall, scattered around, that help stabilize those walls and in some instances help control the permeability, how easy it is for substances to move in and out of the capillaries. So these are so thin, they only allow a single red blood cell to pass through at a time. So there's your a typical red blood cell, and it's going to take up almost the entire lumen in there, the whole diameter of the lumen inside that capillary. All right, so where do we have capillaries? Almost everywhere. You've got to bring oxygen gas and nutrients and ions and hormones and all that good stuff everywhere in the body. But if you guys think back to Biology 201, when you studied tissues, we do have tissues in the body that do not have a good blood supply. So cartilage, for example, is a type of tissue where you don't have a good blood supply. You don't have capillaries passing through the extracellular matrix of your cartilage. Also, if you guys remember the dense, regular connective tissues of ligaments and tendons, you also don't have blood vessels passing through those tissues. They have a poor blood supply. Epithelial tissues, if you guys remember, the cells are all jam-packed close together in an epithelial tissue, so you don't have capillaries running through those tissues as well. Think back to when you studied the skin and the epidermis and how you've got that multiple layers of epithelial cells there in the epidermis, and they're dependent on getting their blood supply from the underlying dermis. Hopefully that's ringing some bells for you from Biology 201. The corneas and the lenses of your eye also do not have their own blood supply, so they're dependent on receiving their oxygen gas and nutrients by diffusion from the surrounding eye fluids. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, your capillaries do have direct access to almost every cell in your body, and I think we've discussed the basic functions many times. They're involved in exchange. The substances that are dissolved in the fluids passing through your capillaries need to move into the surrounding interstitial fluids, the tissue fluids that surround the cells of the body. And also the fluids in your capillaries have to pick up wastes, including CO2. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of cellular respiration. That has to move into the fluid of the capillaries so that your blood vessels can carry those naughty, nasty things away from your cells. You do have different types of capillaries. They fall into three major categories, and those are called continuous capillaries, fenestrated, and sinusoid capillaries. All right, so a little bit more about these continuous capillaries. These are the ones that you have extending throughout your skin and also your muscles, so including your skeletal muscles, your cardiac muscles as well. And in these types of capillaries, so as I was mentioning earlier, the wall of a capillary is just one cell thick, and those cells are, they can be called endothelial cells because this is an endothelium. But just remember, when you see that, that's referring to a layer of simple squamous epithelial tissue that forms that inner lining of your blood vessels and also the inner lining of the heart. So these have intercellular clefts. So those are like little pockets in between the cells, which allows fluids and solutes, smaller solutes, to pass out of the capillaries and into the surrounding tissues, and vice versa. You need to have wastes that move from your tissues back into those capillaries. I do want to point out, in the brain, in the central nervous system, yes, you do have continuous capillaries that extend throughout those tissues to supply the good stuff to the brain and carry away the bad stuff. But there, the individual cells in the walls of the capillaries, they're more tightly packed together. You have these tight junctions. If you remember, we talked about those when we were taking a look at cardiac muscle fibers during Unit 2. Those are kind of like cell snaps. They're proteins that exist and form snap-like structures between cells to help hold them together. So you have the walls of the capillaries passing through your brain are not quite as leaky, and that forms what's called the blood-brain barrier. That means the substances cannot move out of the capillaries and into the brain as easily as they can in other parts of the body. And the reason for that is that provides protection to the brain. You know, if you have, sometimes you don't have good stuff passing through your blood. What if you get exposed to toxic chemicals? Or if you have bacteria in your blood, you're not supposed to have bacteria in your blood, or you have viruses in your blood and your immune system hasn't killed them yet. You don't want it to be as easy for those types of things to get into the brain and cause an infection in the brain, because your brain is sort of important. So the brain is a little more protected than other parts of the body. There are pros and cons to that, but in the case of the brain, the pros of having that extra barrier there outweigh the cons. All right, here is a big time, gigantic blow up of a continuous capillary. All right, so here's, for example, there's an individual cell that's forming part of the wall of the capillary, and the little crack in between there, let me change colors, the little crack in between there, those cracks, those are clefts through which substances can flow out of the capillaries and into the surrounding tissue, including fluids. Remember, your fluids move between body spaces. Hopefully you learned about that in Biology 201, and never forget that. So those are the clefts. You can see how big an individual red blood cell is passing through a continuous capillary. And in blue, the basement membrane, that's a very thin layer. That's not a living layer. That's composed of mainly composed of protein carbohydrate combinations that kind of form a tissue glue that helps anchor those capillaries in place. Notice your continuous capillaries, of these three major types we're going to be talking about, they're actually the least permeable. That means that they're not quite as leaky. It's not as easy for substances to move in and out of that particular type of capillary. All right, then we have capillaries in the body that are called fenestrated capillaries. And fenestrated here means they have more openings or more pores in them. The cells that form the wall have they look like they've had little holes punched in them, and those are called fenestrations. So you have these. This makes sense if you think about it. You have these types of capillaries in parts of the body where you have to do a lot of absorption, or if you need to filter out substances like wastes that you're going to get rid of. And so some example locations: the small intestines. That's where you do most of the digestion of your nutrients takes place there, and so you need to absorb those nutrients. So the capillaries within the walls of the small intestine will be these fenestrated types that allow that to happen. Endocrine glands, that makes sense. Your endocrine glands secrete hormones, and hormones can be picked up by fenestrated type capillaries that surround those endocrine glands a lot better than they could through continuous capillaries. So you're going to have fenestrated capillaries in those locations as well. In the kidneys, You have special capillary beds in the kidneys that filter substances out of the blood and create urine. Urine is filtered blood plasma. And so because in the kidneys, you've got to be able to move solutes out, actually in both directions, out and in, because we've used that term reabsorption before about kidneys, how the kidneys reabsorb the good things before you pee them out. You need to be able to move substances back and forth more easily in that location. So you have these fenestrated capillaries there. Here's a diagram which is showing you what these capillaries look like. So there's the, bring my pen back up here. All right, so there's an individual simple squamous epithelial cell within the wall of the capillary. And notice those cells have pores in them, or holes, which makes it easier for solutes to move in and out of those capillaries. That's the main difference between the two, having those fenestrations or pores in those locations. All right, the third type of capillaries, these are the leakiest of all, the ones where it's the easiest for things to move in and out, and these are called sinusoid capillaries. So they don't have as many tight junctions between the cells and the wall. They usually have fenestrations, the pores, and the clefts between individual cells in the walls of these capillaries are bigger. The cracks are bigger, more or less. They have larger lumens. So there's not a lot of blood pressure in these vessels. Blood tends to flow pretty sluggishly through here, and that's good in the locations where these types of capillaries exist, because the blood is being modified in these particular locations. Things are moving in, things are being taken out, and that includes both larger types of molecules that really can't get out of other types of capillaries, as well as blood cells in many cases also. All right, so where do you have sinusoid type, sorry about that, these types of capillaries? You have them in the liver. The liver does a lot of filtering of substances, and also in the liver, that's one of the locations where your old worn out red blood cells get removed. That also happens in the spleen, as you learned about back in Unit 2. So old worn out red blood cells actually get out of these capillaries in the spleen, so that they can be ingested by macrophages and digested and all their little parts recycled. You also have them in the bone marrow. Remember, the bone marrow is where hematopoiesis takes place. So all those new blood cells that are being cranked out in the bone marrow, you know, well, how do they get into the bloodstream? They enter through these sinusoid type capillaries that extend through the red bone marrow. Adrenal medulla is also another area where you have these types of capillaries, and they exist there to pick up the epinephrine and the norepinephrine hormones that are being secreted from that particular organ. You have macrophages as well. Remember, those are kind of like, those are derived from monocytes. They do phagocytosis. They're like the vacuum cleaners of your body, so they destroy things like bacteria and other types of microorganisms that might inappropriately be in your blood or these organs where these capillaries are located. And also the macrophages are supposed to ingest and digest your old worn out cells and tissues as well, especially the red blood cells like we were talking about with the liver and the spleen. So here's a sinusoid type capillary. And so you can see how holy the walls are. Big fenestrations, big cracks or intercellular clefts between the cells and the walls of those capillaries. All right, so let's talk a little bit about capillary beds and what those are. So we talk about how arterioles lead to capillaries. And then capillaries, that's where you have your exchange with the surrounding tissue fluids, and then those lead to venules. You always have that order of flow. But really, capillaries exist in beds or networks, almost like a netting where you have a whole bunch of them networked with each other to supply blood to particular tissue areas. The arteriole that leads to a capillary bed can be called, there's a terminal arteriole that then connects into a met arteriole, and then the met arteriole leads to the capillary bed. Or now remember how we said that capillary beds are not always open to blood flow. If the tissues served by the capillary bed don't need oxygen gas, the capillary bed gets closed off, and in that case, well, you still need your blood to bypass that capillary bed. It still needs to get to a venule so it can continue its journey back toward the heart. And so there's a bypass that exists around capillary beds that's called a thoroughfare channel. That thoroughfare channel leads to the post-capillary venule. That's the first venule that exists following a particular capillary bed. All right, here's a diagram of that from your textbook. So here is this is a terminal arteriole. So that's a small arteriole that is bringing oxygenated blood to a particular tissue. And then we have an exit off of that. This is called the met arteriole right in here. And blood, oxygenated blood, will flow out of there into capillaries. So this is forming our capillary bed. So you can see how you've got a network of all these different capillaries. You have exchange that takes place with the surrounding tissue fluids, and now you have deoxygenated blood that's passing through the other ends of the capillary bed, and then that winds up draining over here into a post-capillary venule. Now, if you notice on the diagram, you've got these little rings that exist at the entrances to capillaries, and those are called sphincters. Sphincters, those are little rings of smooth muscle cells that contract and they close off the blood flow. They close off the entrances to the capillary bed. So if this tissue over here, you got cells over here in your tissue with tissue fluid surrounding them. If those tissues are already well oxygenated, don't need any nutrients, don't need any oxygen gas, they're not really overly metabolizing, then those sphincters will close, and that way you're not sending blood flow into that capillary bed when it's not needed. The blood still needs to bypass, and that's where it flows through this thoroughfare channel and then directly gets dumped back over here into the post-capillary venule. All right, so in the next video lecture, we'll hear a little bit more about veins before we move on to some additional topics for the chapter.